Hello, and welcome to another episode of EQ Unlocked, where the goal is to explore and guide us toward better awareness, better choices, and creating a better life. My name is Matthew Stevens, and today we're going to be discussing something that a lot of people would rather avoid. And what that something is, you know, but what I caused, who suffered because of me, and essentially what I had to do to make it right. So, before I really dig deep into this, I want to definitely give a shout out to Brandon, who gave me the idea and actually very plainly told me, "Hey, man, this podcast is good, it's great, but you need to start with your voice. It needs to be authentic through and through." And so I just want to tell him thank you for that conversation because it really helped. So thank you with that. So in this episode, we're going to talk about ownership. So it's not about shame. It's about truth. It's about accountability. It's about freedom. Uh, because at the end of the day, emotional intelligence, no matter how calm you are, no matter how much it helps you to regulate and deal with the world around you better going forward, if you're going to be honest with yourself, or if I was going to be honest with myself, there was some damage that caused behind me. And so I had to learn how to take responsibility for that impact, and that was really hard for me. Not because I wanted to avoid accountability or responsibility, but because I felt like taking responsibility was removing the responsibility or carrying the weight of other people's responsibility. And that was a hard sport for me. But what I realized is that no, I'm not taking away from their responsibility at all. That's their choice. And just like I had to carry those demons of not carrying my part of it and not owning my part of the mistakes I made, that's their baggage. And so that's not for me to be concerned with. And so I used to think about, growth was just about healing. But through this journey, I've learned a lot more. That growth is about being honest with yourself. And and the truth is, I wasn't only wounded at times, but at certain times in my life, I was just dangerous. And I couldn't see that. I couldn't see that. But nevertheless, that awareness created a regulation inside me. And then, of course, led to better choices. So I'm going to get to it, and I'm just going to be very direct. People suffered because of me. Period, point blank. Period. People suffered because of me. Now, it wasn't because I was evil. It wasn't because I was trying to hurt people. It was because I didn't know how to regulate myself. I couldn't tell the difference between an imminent threat and a broken system or somebody having a lack of their own emotional regulation. I couldn't decipher the difference between these things. So, being the person that I was with the background I had two modes. It was fight or love. That was it. There was nothing in between. And so, there's this quote and it says, hurt people hurt people. And I love that quote because it's true. When we're hurt, we tend to hurt other people, not intentionally, not violently necessarily, not in ways we even mean to, but we're passing that pain off and we don't even realize it. And then, some of this pain, it hit relationships, some of it hit family, some of it hit work environments, some of it hit friendships. And the bottom line is at the end of the day, the person who suffered the most was me. And I didn't even realize it. And so I reached a point, and it was a point where I just couldn't bargain with myself anymore. I couldn't make any more deals with myself. I couldn't convince myself that this living in the past was helping me anymore. But not living in the past anymore meant for me that I would have to take ownership over some stuff that I really didn't want to. And so I got really real with myself. Now I want to make it clear I got really real with myself as a stopping point, as an end point. I didn't get real with myself so I could dwell in those memories and say, "Oh, poor me, poor me, poor me." No, I didn't want to live in that shame. I didn't want to live in that guilt, but I wanted a hard stop to all the nonsense that was going through my head. And so I got really real with myself. And I sat down and I said out loud, I'm disgusted with myself about these things. I'm disgusted with myself. Now, I don't know if you've ever expressed disgust with yourself, but for me, that was a great turning point because if I acknowledged the disgust I felt with my own behaviors, it only left me one option, which was to go the other way. That it was as simple as that. And so I acknowledged the disgust I felt with myself. I acknowledged the disgust I felt with myself as in regards to allowing into being on the defensive when it came to my family. I acknowledged the disgust that I felt about toward myself, about letting my emotions run the show for so long. I you know, discussed the disgust around the fact that I had let people give me advice who didn't know how to direct their own lives, let alone I was taking their feedback about how to direct mine. I even dealt with the fact of the disgust I felt in regards to my actions towards my God, because I got really real with myself. And in that reality, although it was uncomfortable, it was extremely uncomfortable. It opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to what needed to be done, and therefore it created a pathway to new choices. And so it brought me to a point where there was no longer to explain what had happened. I didn't need to defend what happened. I didn't need to even act like my intentions erased the impact that I had because the impact was real. And so, you know, I when I owned that, when I really owned my disgust with myself, all th- all of a sudden everything I had against everybody else, it dissipated. Because that what does that thing say, like you gotta remove the before you take the straw out of your brother's eye, remove the rafter from your own. That was very, very real for me in that moment. I had removed the rafter from my own eye. And again, at first my greatest fear was that if I own this disgust I feel toward myself, well, that means I'm gonna give everybody else an excuse, eliminating everybody else's wrongdoing. And that was simply a lie. That was a lie to protect my ego. A- And so I started off in I'm gonna be gentle about how I say this next thing. But, you know, I started off by saying the things I was disgusted by. And one of the things that haunted me for a great deal of time was that my sisters were assaulted when I was a child. And I felt disgust with myself that I did not protect them. Now, consciously, I understand that I was a child and I couldn't have protected them. I get that, right? But that has nothing to do with my nervous system and how that ownership, I took that personally and how that impacted a lot of things I did, you know? And so, and I still find myself doing it from time to time, even now. When I see somebody who's helpless or defenseless, or I see somebody else taking advantage of them, I often insert myself into the situation because I'm like, no, you're not going to do this to this person. Not at least not while I'm here. You might do it when I'm gone, but it's not going to happen while I'm here. And sometimes that's healthy, right? If it's a friend, if it's a loved one, if it's a situation that somebody asks for my help, right? Sometimes it's healthy, but far too often I would find myself in situations that had nothing to do with me. It was none of my business. And I would find that the people I was trying to protect would end up being angry at me, which now looking back, I get. I didn't understand at the time, but I certainly understand now. And so I wasn't doing all this I wasn't talking about the things that disgusted me about myself to punish myself. I was doing it to get really real with myself. When you can name these demons that hide in the dark that are inside of you, you bring light to them, right? And how does a shadow survive without light? It doesn't. Or with light, excuse me, it doesn't. Point blank, period. And so then I jumped to another thought. And that thought was by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl said, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is a normal behavior. And so I gave myself that credit that, you know what? Maybe I didn't always act the best way. Maybe I didn't always do what I see now as the best thing, right? Maybe now I would handle things differently than I did in the past. But my life had always been abnormal. And so, of course, my reactions are going to be abnormal. But of course, that would be normal if you look up the entire situation. And so then it took me to my next step, which was forgiveness of myself. And so I'll never forget that day. I sat there, I laid there in my bed, looking up at the ceiling fan. And I went through all these things that disgusted me about myself. And one by one, I put my hand on my chest and I simply said, I forgive myself for X. I forgive myself for Y. I forgive myself for Z. Now, you know, it shifted, right? Once I told the truth out loud and I could forgive myself internally, I didn't need to excuse myself. I didn't need to minimize my behaviors or the things that had happened to me. I didn't need to rewrite history, but I could simply, I could forgive myself and become responsible without being crushed. Forgiveness wasn't saying that I was innocent. Forgiveness of myself wasn't saying that I did everything right or that I was ever going to do everything right in the future. Forgiveness was simply saying that I'm not that person I used to be anymore. And that takes testicular fortitude, my friends. Let me be very direct. That takes some testicular fortitude that you can't even imagine. And so then I move on to well, how does that correlate with making things right? Well, to be very direct, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making things right. I've already accepted that. Now, that doesn't mean it has to drive me every day. It doesn't mean it has to be, I'm not, my name is Earl. I don't have a list. I don't walk around, you know what I'm saying? Just looking for things to make right as far as the past goes. But what I do is each day I show up differently. Each day I show up with becoming more and more the man I am. So a great example of that is in my work life, right? There was a time when somebody would do something to me at work, or I would feel in an unjust situation that took place at work. And I would say, okay, that's how we're going to do this. All right, cool. That's no problem. Gloves off. Let's go to war. And that's exactly what I meant. And there was no chill between me and that war. And I was ready to go, and it wasn't no problem. And it didn't matter how many people were against me in the situation, right? And so imagine how much trouble and challenges that caused for the companies I worked for. So when you look at that in my coworkers, so when I looked at that, I asked myself, well, how are you ever going to make that right? You've impacted many different workplaces, you know, and how are you going to make that right? And so the truth is that I was going to make it right by showing up, being authentic, standing up for myself, but doing so in a way that wasn't emotionally driven. It was going to be looking when there's a breakdown. I look at things and I say, okay, is this a person problem or is this a system problem? And so I went back through my life. I went back through my life I probably had problems with 3 or 4 different employers. And I look at those experiences that I had and I said every time it was a mixture of 2 things. One, my side of the coin is there was an emotional issue, right? I felt attacked. I felt like you had done something to me. And for whatever reason, I always had this thing about documenting everything. So it was never just left up to chance. I didn't never just say like, "Oh, well, you made me feel this way." No, no, no. I had documentation, and most of the time, months of documentation, right? And you may be thinking to yourself, "Well, that's pretty extreme," or that's maybe you think it's smart. Yeah, I thought it was smart, but the reality of it is that had my emotions not got involved in the first place, there would have been a lot less for me to document. Because just like you, I'm sure you know that once you see the world through a certain view, once you see a group of people through a certain view, that's going to be your perception. And so you're going to see everything that takes place through that perception. Now, there were some pretty rough things that happened. I went through some pretty bad things, and I'm not going to excuse those things. You know, there was a time where I worked for an entity, and we worked with children, and I was told by leadership to not feed a certain child or children if they didn't go to school. And I responded back by sending the Ohio Revised Code, and I explained to them that I would not be doing that. And less than 3 weeks later, I was fired. Now I got my job back very, very easily. I got my job back, but the tone was already set. And so then what happened is they had to release the person who was basically responsible for me being fired. And but that led to a whole cycle of issues with everybody else because, well, they couldn't see the bigger picture. They couldn't see the wrong and the unjust in being fired for refusing to feed a child, right? And so that situation spiraled. And because I felt like I was stuck at that employer because of the custody case I had to deal with as far as, my daughter, I was it just spiraled and things got worse and worse and worse. And I'm sure there were some innocent people who got hurt in that situation. I'm sure of it. How do I make that right? And so I sat back and I asked myself, well, how can you make this right? How can you make this right? How can you do this? How can you improve not the past, but improve the future, not just for yourself, but for anybody else? And so I developed a tool to help people in the workplace, and wow, wow. So once I got really real with myself, I was able to find solutions that I couldn't find when I was lying to myself, when I was defensive, when I was letting my ego run the show. I owned what I did and how I felt without defense. I no longer needed to blame my past for my choices. I now looked at my past as a way to create better options for the future. Of course, I started regulating before I started reacting. I repaired what I could, and I accepted that some things I wasn't going to be able to fix, and I honored that. Long story short, I came to accept that accountability is in the moment. It was the way I was going to live my life from that point forward. And so then came in the next part, right? The new identity. And so this is really for me where emotional intelligence really becomes real at. And so I started looking at things and dealing with people in a very different way. I didn't start looking at people and say, this makes me feel bad. I started looking at people and really questioning, like, okay, what is the best possible way I can deal with this situation for everybody involved? And for a long time, I've been the person who walked into more growth, right? I had been the type of person who had been trying to grow. But what happened after I had this disgust conversation is I took on a whole new identity. I became the person who doesn't, I became the person who protected other people from my unhealed parts. But guess what that required? It required me to acknowledge that there were some unhealed parts of myself. And so, you know, as we reach the close of this episode, I want to I want to ask you some questions for you to ask yourself. And, I'm going to go back into this later on and we're going to go much deeper. because please know that if I didn't mention you in this episode right here, that doesn't mean I haven't thought about you, right? If I didn't explicitly, if you haven't heard from me to make these things right, it's not because I forgot about you. It's because it just hasn't been time yet. And so, with that, I want to give you a few questions to sit with. And this might be uncomfortable, so you might want to do it alone. But ask yourself, who suffered because of the way you handled your emotions? What's some truths you've been refusing to say, or at least avoiding to say out loud? What pattern do you need to stop defending? What pattern are you displaying that needs to die? And what would making it right look like this week? Not with words, but with actions. What would making things look right look like? We're not trapped with who we used to be. And the fact that you can tell the truth about where you're at, about where you came from, about where you're headed, well, that means that you're strong enough to change your future. And so, with that, as always, be amazing, be you.
As this episode comes to a close, take a moment to notice what stood out for you. Emotional intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about building awareness, understanding yourself and the people around you, and choosing how you respond, especially when things feel difficult. Growth happens through reflection and practice, not pressure or perfection. If this conversation supported you, consider sharing it with someone who may benefit from it as well. To explore more tools and resources around emotional intelligence and personal development, connect with EQ Unlocked and Knowles. Until next time, remember, better awareness leads to better choices, and better choices lead to a better life. This is EQ Unlocked.